A lake that once sat quietly inland somehow ended up 300 feet deeper within a single human lifetime. If that sounds impossible, it's because for years most geologists assumed it was. Then they drilled into the floor of the Black Sea and found something that shouldn't be there at all: a drowned freshwater shoreline, sitting hundreds of feet below the surface, hundreds of feet below where any natural lake edge should ever sit. Something violent happened here roughly 7,600 years ago. Some researchers now believe it wasn't just a flood. They believe it was the flood, the real, physical event that quietly seeded one of the most repeated stories in human history. Here's what makes this genuinely different from most ancient flood legends floating around the internet. Nearly every culture across the ancient Near East told some version of the same story. A catastrophic flood. Survivors chosen or lucky enough to escape. A world that had to be rebuilt almost from nothing. The Sumerians told it. The Babylonians told it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Hebrew Bible told it as the story of Noah. For centuries, scholars treated these as separate myths that simply happened to echo each other, or as one story borrowed and rewritten as it spread between neighboring cultures. Nobody seriously entertained the idea that they might all be describing the exact same real event, remembered differently by people who scattered in different directions after living through it together. That changed in 1997, when two geologists from Columbia University, William Ryan and Walter Pitman, published a hypothesis that quietly. This is where the story starts connecting to something much bigger than one flooded valley on one ancient map. If entire farming communities really were displaced this suddenly and this violently, they wouldn't have simply vanished quietly into history without a trace. They would have scattered, carrying with them the one story that mattered more than any other: the day the sea came and never stopped rising. Some researchers argue these displaced populations may have fled outward in every direction, into the Danube Valley toward Europe, south toward Mesopotamia, and east toward the Caucasus. Each group carried a version of the same lived catastrophe into a new home, a new language, and eventually, an entirely new mythology of its own. So here's the question worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further. If this flood really happened the way Ryan and Pitman describe it, could it actually be the buried, literal root of Noah's flood, and of the flood tablets buried in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia? The honest answer is that this remains one of the most genuinely contested ideas in modern archaeology. We need to be careful not to oversell it just because it makes a better story. But the physical evidence supporting the flood itself, regardless of the mythology question, is genuinely significant. And it comes from a source you might not expect at all: a legendary deep-sea explorer better known for finding the Titanic. In 1999, oceanographer Robert Ballard led an expedition specifically designed to test the Ryan-Pitman hypothesis directly on the Black Sea floor. His team used submersible robots to survey the seabed roughly 300 feet below the current surface. What they found there was extraordinary. A clearly defined ancient shoreline appeared in their scans, complete with what looked like the remains of collapsed structures. It sat exactly where a freshwater lake's edge would have been before the flood, and exactly where a sudden, catastrophic marine incursion would have submerged it beneath rising salt water almost overnight. Radiocarbon dating of freshwater mollusk shells recovered near that ancient shoreline consistently returned dates clustering right around 7,500 to 7,600 years old. The layer directly above then abruptly switched to saltwater species. Something clearly changed here, fast, and the ocean floor itself recorded the exact moment it happened. And here's where the story takes its first real turn. Not every geologist studying this data agrees on how fast, or how catastrophic, this flood actually was in practice. Critics of the original Ryan-Pitman model argue the sedimentary evidence doesn't necessarily require water to have surged in as violently or as quickly as the original 1997 paper proposed. Some competing studies suggest the transition from fresh to saltwater conditions may have unfolded over a longer window, potentially decades rather than months. That's still dramatically fast by normal geological standards, but meaningfully slower than the single catastrophic season most popular retellings of the theory tend to describe online. This distinction genuinely matters, because a flood spanning decades would have felt very different to the people actually living through it than a flood spanning only weeks. This is exactly the kind of nuance that gets flattened whenever this story gets simplified into a viral headline. It's worth pausing here to be honest about it rather than rushing past. What nearly every researcher on both sides of this debate does agree on is that a significant, geologically rapid, and genuinely disruptive flooding event did occur in this basin roughly 7,600 years ago. What remains contested is the precise speed. By extension, exactly how sudden and mythology-generating the catastrophe would have actually felt to the people living beside it at the time. Some researchers argue even a flood unfolding across several decades could still have generated powerful, lasting oral traditions. This would especially hold true in communities that measured time primarily through the memory of living elders rather than any kind of written calendar. So let's follow the archaeological trail a little further, because this is exactly where the story genuinely deepens. If displaced farming populations really did flee this region after the flood, we should reasonably expect to see a corresponding wave of new agricultural settlement spreading into neighboring regions around the same general time period. And remarkably, that's roughly what the archaeological record actually does show. Farming technology and Neolithic settlement patterns do appear to expand into parts of southeastern Europe and the wider Danube basin during a broadly overlapping window of time. Whether this expansion was directly caused by flood refugees, or whether it was already happening independently for entirely separate reasons, with the timing simply lining up by coincidence, remains a genuinely open question. Researchers are still actively working to resolve it using isotope analysis and ancient DNA studies drawn from burial sites across the region. Now let's turn to the mythology side of this story directly, because this is the part that captures public imagination most powerfully. It's also the part demanding the most careful, honest handling of all. The Mesopotamian flood story, first recorded in the Epic of Gilgamesh and echoed later in the Hebrew account of Noah, describes a flood so total it required divine warning, a specially built vessel, and a small group of survivors tasked with beginning the world over again from almost nothing. These aren't vague, general flood stories about heavy seasonal rain washing out a few fields. They share remarkably specific structural details across cultures that had no obvious contact with one another. A worn survivor, a constructed boat, paired or grouped animals brought aboard, and a bird sent out afterward to search for dry land. That level of specific, shared narrative structure across multiple independent ancient cultures is genuinely unusual. It's exactly the kind of pattern that first made scholars suspect a shared historical root sitting quietly beneath the shared myth. But here's the necessary caution, and it deserves real weight in this story rather than a passing mention squeezed in at the end. The Mesopotamian flood epics were written down roughly 2,000 years after the proposed Black Sea flood event. That's an enormous gap of time for oral tradition to travel, change, and blend with other, entirely separate flooding events that almost certainly also happened across the ancient Near East during that same multi-millennia stretch. The Tigris and Euphrates river valleys themselves were prone to serious, damaging seasonal flooding entirely independent of anything happening at the Black Sea. Some scholars argue the flood myths we know today may be a layered composite. They may blend memories of several genuinely different flooding events across many centuries into one single, dramatically compressed story, rather than serving as a direct, unbroken record of the Black Sea event specifically and alone. This is precisely why serious researchers studying this connection tend to describe it as a compelling, evidence-supported hypothesis rather than a settled historical fact. Any account that presents it with total, unqualified certainty in either direction simply isn't being fully honest about where the actual research currently stands. What can be said with genuine confidence is this: a real, significant, geologically documented flood did occur in the Black Sea basin roughly 7,600 years ago. It happened during precisely the era when Near Eastern oral traditions about a great, world-defining flood were almost certainly already beginning to take shape and quietly circulate between neighboring peoples. There's one more thread worth pulling on before we close this story, because it connects directly back to those submerged structures Ballard's team first identified on the seafloor decades ago. If people really were living, farming, and building along that ancient lakeshore before the flood struck, then an entire layer of early Neolithic settlement history may currently be sitting preserved beneath 300 feet of the modern Black Sea. Much of it remains largely inaccessible using conventional archaeological methods available today. Deep, cold, oxygen-poor water at that depth can actually preserve organic material remarkably well. This means any wooden structures, tools, or textiles genuinely resting down there could be extraordinarily well preserved compared to equivalent sites recovered on dry land. Some researchers have specifically argued this submerged region may represent one of the most significant unexplored archaeological frontiers left anywhere in the world, an entire vanished coastal culture waiting directly beneath water most people simply sail across today without a second thought. There's also a broader pattern worth noticing here, one that stretches well beyond this single basin. Around the same general window of time, rising post-glacial seas were reshaping coastlines across the entire planet. They drowned parts of Sundaland in Southeast Asia. They submerged the ancient hunting grounds of Doggerland between Britain and mainland Europe. They quietly erased countless smaller river valleys and lockshores that once supported thriving human communities. The Black Sea flood wasn't an isolated anomaly happening in one unlucky corner of the world. It was one particularly fast, particularly well-documented chapter in a much larger global story of coastlines in violent motion. A story written into seabeds on nearly every continent, most of it still waiting for someone to go looking. So where does this genuinely leave us, after decades of continued excavation, debate, and careful scientific scrutiny on both sides of the argument? The flood itself is real, supported by consistent geological and archaeological evidence recovered directly from the Black Sea floor. The precise speed and violence of that flood remains a legitimately contested question among specialists. It meaningfully shapes how catastrophic and mythology-generating the actual lived experience would have felt to the people who survived it and told others about it afterward. And the direct link between this specific flood and the written flood myths of Gilgamesh and Noah remains a compelling, well-argued, but ultimately unproven hypothesis, not a fully confirmed historical fact ready to be stated outright as settled truth. What makes this story worth sitting with isn't a clean, tidy answer wrapped up with a bow. It's the genuinely unsettling possibility that some of humanity's oldest and most widely repeated stories may not be pure invention at all. They may be distorted, layered memory, passed mouth to mouth across roughly 2,000 years, slowly reshaping a real geological catastrophe into a story about divine judgment and a single chosen family. If that's even partly true, then somewhere beneath the surface of a story you likely already knew before this video began, there may be an actual, physical shoreline. There may be a real farming village. There may be a real family who once watched the sea rise faster than they could ever hope to run. The flood didn't just build a myth. It may have quietly built the very idea that the world can end, and that a few ordinary people can still survive to tell the story afterward. So here's the question worth carrying with you after this video ends. If a real flood really did become the seed of one of history's most repeated stories, how many other ancient myths we still dismiss as pure legend might be sitting on top of a genuine, buried, physical event, simply waiting for someone to finally go looking?